Hey everybody, my name is Sebastian Rojas Baquero. I'm a mixer and producer for stereo and Dolby Atmos, and this that you are about to watch is a recording of a workshop I did a couple of weeks ago together with master engineer Gerhard Westphalen. Gerhard is an amazing master engineer who has worked with artists such as Doja Cat and Burna Boy, and he's an expert in everything audio, such as room design, acoustics, speaker design, mastering, of course. And he took the time and prepared a presentation for us to discuss his approach, thoughts, philosophy around Dolby Atmos mastering and how it differs from stereo mastering. I do these kind of workshops a couple of times a year, so if you would like to attend to one of these, then go to my Instagram and follow me. There's where I normally announce these kind of events. With no more further ado, here's the video. I hope you enjoy it, that you learn a lot from it, and have a great day. Make great music. Bye.
Hey everyone. So happy to be here. What I'd like to do today is just share a couple of ideas I've jotted down about Atmos mastering in general. Nothing too detailed. We're not going to be diving into sessions or anything to discuss, how did I EQ this particular track or anything like that. Just more general approach to mastering. And mainly how it overlaps with stereo, where it differs, where it's somewhat similar. And yeah, I think that would be probably the most beneficial to anyone either here or who might be listening to this later on. Yeah, so I'd like to go through some of these ideas I've jotted down, and then after that we can open it up to questions and see if you guys want to dive into any of these ideas a little deeper, or just ask about anything else relating to Atmos and working in Atmos. The most important idea is that Atmos mastering is really not terribly different from stereo. So we have a couple of additional aspects we need to look at, but in general, it's pretty much the same. Being a mastering engineer it's not really any different whether you're doing stereo or Atmos. Your general responsibilities are still the same. So I think it kind of breaks down into two separate components. The first one is the musical aspects of it, and the second is the QC aspects of it. So for on the musical side of things, that's where we talk about, am I going to EQ this? How might I want to EQ this, or do some kind of dynamics processing, anything like that, where we're really changing, or we might be changing the record and how it's going to sound ultimately. So this really comes down to, do I want to change something or not, right? Do I want to EQ this? Do I not want to? If so, how do I want to do it? So, that really applies to both stereo and Atmos. You're going to listen to what you've received, and then come up with these things you may or may not want to do. So the thought process there is no different from stereo. One of the things that sort of restrict you and your decision making in whether you might want to change something or not is also largely determined by the client and their general approach to things. Some people want things that not necessarily change. They might tell you something, we like how this is, please don't change that in any way. Or you might just have an established relationship with someone and know, maybe I shouldn't do this, even if I would want to do this. I know that whoever I might be working with, whether it's the mixing engineer or artist, that's not something that they would necessarily be happy with. So, it's not necessarily just my own personal thoughts on whether I think something should change or not, but also keeping in mind the team and what they might be after. And now the musical aspects, or the musical side of it, is ultimately about taste. That's kind of what people come to me for, is my taste, my musical experiences, things along those lines. And that again applies to stereo or Atmos. It's no different. It still has that, fundamentally it's that taste component. And I mean, it's nothing unique to mastering. Everyone on the team is responsible for bringing their own taste to the project, whether it be the artist or the recording engineer, the mixing engineer. But we all have our own little subset area of the project where we're bringing that taste component to. The artist obviously has the freedom to essentially do whatever they want. They're writing a song. They can literally write whatever song they want, pretty much. Obviously then the recording engineer has to take that and maybe translate some of the intentions of the artist into how they might want to record the project or produce certain aspects. And again, the mix engineer has their own area in the sort of production pipeline where they're bringing their taste. And then ultimately in mastering, there's a somewhat more limited range of things you can do to bring your own tastes and experiences to the project. But again, whether that's stereo or Atmos, it doesn't really matter. It's all about what I can bring to the project, and the specific format of things doesn't change anything. What is different for Atmos is the spatial component. So the sort of panning things around you. And that's somewhat different from stereo. That's a lot. You have a much wider range that you can play with. So there is some aspect of developing and being able to bring that sense of taste to a project, and whether you want to change something or not again. So, do I want the sound to be over here, or do I want it to be over there? Do I want to move this a bit? So that's kind of what's more unique to Atmos in the musical side of things. You have a little more you can play with, and that you're ultimately responsible for overseeing and changing or not changing again. So that just makes Atmos a little more tricky, or you need a little more experience to be able to do that, to develop those skills and ultimately be able to make those decisions. Now, the other aspect of mastering is what would generally fall under QC, right? Your quality control. So whether it's for stereo or Atmos, you have to deal with a lot of the formats and specs. You're delivering different sample rates, bit depth, things like that. The master engineer is ultimately responsible for creating the final deliverables and making sure you're meeting whatever needs to be delivered for the project. If they want MP3s, you got to get them MP3s. And so, you're somewhat responsible for creating this final set or package of deliverables that gets sent out. Now with Atmos, obviously there are a lot more guidelines that you need to follow, or additional specs that you need to follow, whether it be determined by the Apple specs, or whether it be determined by a label. They have their own rules you need to follow, and they're going to bounce back your master if you don't follow those rules. So Atmos does have a few more boxes you need to check and go through, whether it be for loudness or the different export settings you need to change, the trim, as well as syncing to the stereo master, making sure your Atmos master is perfectly synced to the stereo. That's another thing that falls under QC, and creating the final deliverables that are acceptable. Then there's the actual QC of the masters. So, listening through everything, making sure it's all okay, making sure you don't have any issues, kind of glitches that might happen. So in Atmos, it can get a little trickier just because you have, most of the time at least, you have a lot of elements, whether they be, you have your beds and your objects and all that. So sometimes things can go wrong. Sometimes something might be missing. You might have an element that was in the stereo mix that, for whatever reason, got lost somewhere and is no longer in the Atmos. You might have, I've had cases where for whatever reason there were some empty objects that got printed in the ADM, but there's no audio in them, and you have to delete those, otherwise it can bounce back to you. Things like that. Atmos has a few more additional things to watch out for and be mindful of, whereas in the stereo, you're not going to be, it's very unlikely you'll be missing an element in your master unless you're talking about some alts that you're comparing to the main mix. If there's a missing tom in your stereo master, as a master engineer, that's not really something I would know. If I just been giving a single file, I can't know what should and shouldn't be in there. Whereas with an Atmos, I've obviously have the stereo master and then the Atmos master. I need to compare the two and make sure nothing is really different, or something could be different, but then in that case it should be intentionally so. With keyseeing the Atmos masters, you also have the additional step of the down mixes and listening to the different formats. So, I think that falls largely under QC of listening to the different down mixes, like 5.1, 4, or 2.0, the binaural. You kind of need to check through. I don't necessarily check through every format, on every master. It's largely about developing somewhat of an intuition about what might change and what may or may not necessarily translate, and then watching out for that and checking it on the different formats. So I'm not literally going to listen through every down mix format and the song entirely through. I might listen to specific sections and jump around between the formats and just seeing how that's changing, how that's translating. So that's, again, a somewhat unique component compared to stereo mastering. And then lastly, you also have to ensure the quality for the end listener. With stereo mastering, that might be thinking about how things will end up on streaming. So, watching out for your peak levels, and obviously there's the whole conversation about loudness normalization. So, you are ultimately responsible for a lot of that, and just ensuring that the product will translate to that final streaming or whatever it might be getting released to. With Atmos, again, you have that as well, and you want to check on the different formats, whether it be AirPods or kind of the most widely used devices that people will be listening on. So it's important to check on AirPods. But as far as this aspect goes, Atmos is a lot more unpredictable than stereo. You don't have such a fixed target you're working towards. You don't have, say, your streaming codecs that it's going to go through to end up on Spotify. With Atmos, these things may or may not change. So I personally don't work all that closely towards optimizing for a specific delivery format. For example, when you listen to your mix, your Atmos mix, and compare the kind of your full ADM full resolution format to the MP4, you're going to lose a lot. It's going to not sound quite as nice. And you could perhaps change some things and try to improve the MP4 experience, that kind of lossy compression format that you get. But again, that's going to be more of a moving target, and we don't know where things will end up and how that experience might change in the future. Whereas with stereo, it's a little more fixed. How things sound on Spotify with stereo likely isn't going to change anytime soon, unless they go to lossless. The lossy side of things is really predictable, and you can kind of listen through the different formats, different bit rates, and what it's going to be like. That's not something that's likely to change really ever. Everyone's moving towards lossless, so you kind of don't really need to worry about that anymore as much. Whereas with Atmos, it's all pretty much lossy. There's no lossless really right now at the moment. That would be great if there was, but there just isn't. So we need to work towards that, but at the same time, it's somewhat of a moving target, which makes things a little more unique for Atmos compared to stereo mastering. Now, in general, when you have an Atmos project, there are different ways that the team can approach the Atmos, and that ultimately determines how my approach is going to be for the project. So on one end of the spectrum, you have a team who wants the Atmos to be the same as the stereo. And your job, the mixing engineer's job and my job, is just to match the stereo master as closely as possible. Perhaps they're not happy with necessarily what Atmos is doing, how it's affecting their records, or perhaps they just don't particularly care for Atmos. It's somewhat of just an extra deliverable what they need to deliver, and they're not particularly paying attention to what's going with Atmos. So they just want it to match the stereo, and anything different is something they're not going to be happy with. So my role there might be to make larger changes, more drastic changes to the mix. If I see a way that I can bring it closer to the stereo. So perhaps what the engineer has done isn't necessarily exactly as a stereo, and I might see a way to push it a little closer. That's definitely not the way that I would approach things personally, but that's just what certain teams want to go for. Then you have, moving a little away from that, is where you want it to still be close to the stereo, but with a little more added envelopment or spaciousness. So again, your goal is to match the stereo. You want it to feel the same. You don't want the mix itself to be any different, but just adding a bit of more space around it and feeling like it's the stereo mix, but with a little something added to it. So again, there I might be making more drastic changes if I see a way to take it from something that isn't translating all that well to something that's a little closer to the stereo mix. And then moving a little further from that, you have where the Atmos mix might be completely different from the stereo. It's the team crafted it as its own separate product, as its own mix. They weren't particularly paying attention to the stereo mix. I'm not saying it's a different arrangement or anything like that, but they're just trying to take more advantage of the format and mix it in more of a unique way, try to get more out of it rather than just a little more spaciousness to the mix. Now, so in this case, I'm going to be a little more careful with the changes I might make, because the team will likely have spent more time crafting the Atmos mix, and I don't want to ruin anything that they've done there. If they have a certain element panned somewhere, then I need to maintain that intention and not just move it somewhere else, because the stereo sounded different. I need to try to understand what they're doing and then preserve that. And lastly, on sort of the opposite side of the spectrum from someone who wants to just match the stereo, would be someone who has done the project starting out with Atmos in mind. So that could be recording things in Atmos, producing things in Atmos, or just from the beginning thinking about how they're ultimately going to be working in Atmos. So this is likely done more from an earlier production stage rather than just taking essentially a stereo mix and going into Atmos after that. And they might have even just started the project from the beginning with Atmos in mind, where stereo is more just an afterthought of, okay, we have this Atmos mix, and now we just need to produce a stereo mix to get released everywhere that the Atmos isn't going to be accessible. So again, in that case, it's similar where I need to be a little more careful with what the mixer might have done and preserving that, trying to understand their intention and essentially not ruining their mix. And this does go back to stereo, where a big part of my job is to preserve what's there and try to understand what they're after, what they were after in mixing, and try to potentially highlight that or preserve that, or maybe dial that back, but still having that intention be present. So as far as preserving that intention of the mix in Atmos, can be a little tougher because we have more moving parts. So an example of this would be the center channel or the LFE, and how a mixer may choose to use those or not use those. You could have your lead vocal be in the center. You could have it be kind of a phantom center by using the left and the right. You could have a combination of those where it's all in the LCR, and all those speakers have some balance of that lead vocal. So Atmos has more components that I need to look out for as far as preserving the intention of the mix goes. So my approach is generally to not change too much unless I see it being a problem. So, whether I might prefer a phantom center or using the center channel myself doesn't really matter. I'm most likely to go with whatever's in the mix. So I might adjust things slightly if I see it to be a problem, most likely with how it translates into the other down mixes or other formats like the spatial audio. But most likely I'm going to just preserve how they're there. I'm not going to, by default, not use the center channel and just take it out and put it into the left and the right. I'm going to try to just preserve what the mixer did and maybe tweak it slightly. If it's something that I feel just isn't working, I might go back to the mixing engineer and ask them, how intentional was this decision? Sometimes they just did it because they were using a stereo stem, and so that it just went to the left and the right, and nothing's in the center. So that's just how they started out with the mix, and they didn't really put too much thought into, should I take this vocal and put it just in the center speaker? So in that case, if I do see it being a problem, I might suggest, okay, well, maybe you should try changing it like this, and maybe send them a version with and without that change made to the mix. Other times, they'll get back to me and say, yeah, this is how we crafted it to be. This is what we found to be working and translating how we want it to be. And so obviously in that case, it's something I wouldn't really want to mess with too much. Another aspect which applies both to stereo and Atmos mastering is to not try to make the mix something it's not, especially in mastering. In mixing, you already want to be a little careful with taking the elements you have and not trying to strong arm it into something else. You want to just take a look at what you have, what you've been given, and see what you can make of that, instead of having an idea of, I want to make a song like this artist, and we're just going to take these elements and try to push them in that direction and make them something they're not. So in mastering, again, I have to take a similar approach of perhaps they want it to sound more like this, but the mix isn't particularly geared towards that. So my approach is to just look at it as a whole and see what this record should be, what is there, what I can bring out, rather than trying to drive it in a different direction where it's maybe not so well suited for. So again, this applies both to stereo and Atmos. With Atmos, generally we do have a little more wiggle room. Usually having a lot of objects and things separated out means I could potentially change things more drastically than I'd be able to with a stereo mix. And along those lines, both with stereo and Atmos, I don't generally use any kind of ref tracks. If the client sends something along saying, this is kind of the vibe we're going for, honestly, I generally just ignore that, because mastering isn't really the time to be saying, well, this is what we got, this is what we want, let's try to make it into that. But, we're a little past the point of being able to do that. My approach is more to take what we have and just see, what is it? What do we have? What can I do to make this what the best it can be, rather than let's take this and turn it into something else. So a couple of places where Atmos tends to differ more from stereo. One of the biggest issues is the translation from the binaural to speakers. A lot of the mastering I do for Atmos is for engineers who are just working on headphones, so they just have the binaural. So a large part of what I'm doing is checking how things translate to the speakers, and I might be the only person to really ever hear it on speakers before it's released. And even after it's released, the percentage of people listening on a full Atmos surround system is very small. So the biggest problem here is that the mixing engineer's intentions don't necessarily translate all that well when working on binaural and not listening on speakers. The biggest issue there being that the panning doesn't stick out quite as much on your binaural. You pan something out behind you, it tends to sound fine on the binaural, but listening through the speaker system, it's going to be a lot more distracting. With the headphones, you can somewhat hear that effect of pulling it behind you, but it doesn't necessarily get distracting like it would on speakers. So one of the biggest things I have to watch out for when working in this situation where I've gotten a mix that's only worked in binaural and I'm sort of the first person hearing it on speakers is to translate that intention of the mixer and try to understand what they were going for and create that experience on the speakers without it causing problems. So one of the things you might notice if you've worked on binaural sort of exclusively is you can pan something behind you and you'll hear that it's behind you. You'll hear that effect of panning something behind you. But if you were to just give the headphones over to someone else and have them listen, they're not necessarily going to hear that same effect. A large part of hearing that effect comes down to knowing the intention you had in panning that sound behind you. So you can make a very immersive sort of mix that has things all around you. And when you listen to that on the headphones, assuming you're the one who created that mix, you're going to hear the intentions that you had. You're going to hear those sounds that you put behind you as if they are behind you. But someone else listening to that mix, not having been there for the crafting of that spatialization, won't necessarily hear those intentions come through. They're just going to hear it more as almost as a stereo mix. They're not going to really get those same intentions coming through to them. And that's just because the way that the binaural works. We're all going to hear it different without the personalized transfer functions and all that. So it is more of it sort of smooths out the listening experience, and you don't get such drastic panning. It just kind of blends in and becomes, it might still sound very immersive, but you don't necessarily get those same intentions coming through the mix. And obviously when you put it out on speakers, then now everyone's going to hear that sound that's coming from behind you. So a large part of the Atmos mastering, when we're coming from someone who is working only on the binaural, is understanding those intentions of the mix and making sure they're going to translate without necessarily being offensive and sticking out. So the first thing I do when I get these mixes that were worked mainly on or exclusively on the binaural is to listen to the binaural on its own, usually without really looking at the kind of the graphics, in the renderer window showing you all the panning, where the objects are, and just listen to it without visually seeing their intentions, and see how that binaural is sounding, see what's sticking out, maybe trying to hear where things are panned, if they're behind me, if they're not, if they're up, above. And then what I'll do is, listen again and now look at what they did, visually seeing the renderer window with the objects and whatnot, and starting to understand where they put things. So that then changes my listening experience. Even though I'm just listening through to what they delivered to me, just the binaural, I haven't changed anything. That already changes my listening experience, and I start to decompose what they've done for their Atmos mix. From there, I can then switch to the speakers and see how that starts to translate out. And knowing their intentions, I can then potentially dial it back. If something is way out in the back and on the speakers it's sticking out as being distracting, particularly with percussion elements, you have a hi-hat that was panned too far out, and it sticks out of the mix. I'm going to dial that back, but I still have that reference frame of listening to the binaural for the first time and not necessarily having that, not knowing that hi-hat was necessarily panned out back there. The more smooth out experience of the binaural, because a lot of people on the team they likely didn't have that experience of sitting during the mixing session and knowing that the engineer took that hi-hat and put it way out in the side. They just received this stereo wave file that they listened to, and it sounds great. It sounds more immersive than the stereo. So I need to juggle between preserving that original binaural experience and then making it work on the speakers, and then bringing that back down to the binaural so that we're not changing things too much. Things still sound as immersive. So if I brought that hi-hat down or maybe changed the location, it still needs to feel roughly the same, like I haven't really affected that binaural. And in general, so just preserving the intentions of the mixer or the team as a whole. So now, sort of unique case is when things are mixed through spatial, if they're mixed in Logic, specifically through the Apple spatial, rather than the Dolby's binaural. In this case, we tend to have much more different results in how things translate. A lot of people won't even listen to the Dolby binaural format. They'll work exclusively in the spatial. So that can create a new set of challenges where it could potentially translate even less than how a binaural would translate into the speakers. Particularly with how things might be EQ'd. If the team is going for the approach of let's just make it match the stereo, we don't want this whole Atmos thing. We just want another stereo, something that sounds like our stereo master. Well, they're more likely to EQ things that might have changed when they switched over to working on spatial. So now that we pull it up on the speakers, or even just the binaural, that EQ move is going to sound a lot more different than the stereo. So they've tried to make that spatial closer to the stereo, but then they've made the binaural and Atmos on speakers further from the stereo. So again, it becomes a bit of a juggling act where I'm trying to bring it all together, and they're telling me we want it more like stereo, and maybe they were already pretty happy with how that spatial was in terms of closeness to the stereo, but now I might have to make it a little further from the stereo in order to get the binaural, just keeping in mind that a lot of people will be listening not to spatial, they'll be listening to the other streaming platforms where you're going to get that binaural experience. And of course, spatial could potentially change in the future. So I tend to err on the side of making the Atmos closer rather than relying on getting the spatial closer, even though at the moment, you might be getting most of your streams on Apple, and that might be what you're prioritizing, but I'd rather go for getting the fundamental ADM file to be as close as we can get it to, just because we do have a bit of a moving target there with everything else and how that might change in the future, and that those EQ moves might start to stick out a little more, and you might lose that closeness you were creating to the stereo. So again, it's just difficult to draw the line of how much do we want to prioritize the spatial versus the other Atmos experiences, and how we want that to translate. So some suggestions: if you're only able to work on binaural, either working in spatial, like in Logic, or just the Dolby's binaural in any other DAW. So my biggest suggestion there would be to imagine the speaker experience, because again, it's fairly easy to understand your own intention through the binaural. So you pan a sound behind you, and it's going to sound behind you. So it's somewhat easy to create your own binaural experience when you're working, but that's not necessarily going to translate out to anyone else or onto the speakers. So I would try to not focus so much on getting a mix in binaural that you're happy with, but thinking more about the speaker experience in the end. So you're going to pan the sound behind you. I would tend to focus more on how would this sound behind me, and sort of imagine that sound coming from behind me, rather than just panning it in the DAW and listening on your headphones and thinking, yeah, that sounds great. I'm happy with how that sounds. I would kind of take a step back from that, and even before you pan that sound back, I would just listen. Might be listening just in stereo even to this element, not any kind of through any binaural processing, and think, okay, I'm going to take this element, I'm going to bring it behind me. How is that going to sound? So that's kind of looking more into the side of the psychoacoustics and trying to understand how you're going to perceive that in the end, at least if it's ever played back on speakers. So I do think it's important to understand some of those psychoacoustic effects, particularly how things can get distracting. Another aspect of working on the speakers versus on the binaural is you do have a lot more space in somewhat of a literal sense. When you put your elements around the room, they're going to be a little more unmixed. They're going to stand out on their own. It's not going to be such a cohesive sounding mix. Whereas on the binaural, it's still going to sound relatively similar to what you might get with a stereo mix, that sort of cohesive mix sounding approach, compared to listening to like separate stems. If you're soloing through your stems, that's a little more what it can be like when you're panning things out around the room and you have a sound in the front, a sound in the back. Those are going to sound very separate from each other. It's going to be easy to draw your attention to either of those sounds, and they can draw your attention and be distracting much more easily. Whereas on the headphones, it's going to sound a lot more like a single cohesive mix, and things will kind of blend together, and you're not going to get things sticking out quite as much. So I'd say just try to keep that all in mind while you're working. So perhaps focus a little less on the actual listening, and just take some time to think through those decisions you're making and how they're going to translate to the speaker experience. Another challenge, of course, is spatial audio, and how you might EQ things differently. Like if you're trying to match your lead vocals, how it sounds in the stereo, to how it's going to sound on spatial. So that's another thing you need to juggle with. So I'd suggest listening through both spatial and the Dolby binaural, and just try to juggle those. And I wouldn't rely too much on one or the other. I wouldn't just go on to spatial and make your vocals sound exactly the same and call it a day. I would suggest going back and forth and trying to find the best balance between the two that is going to get that best translation in the end. And perhaps you're going to sacrifice the Atmos side of things a little more to prioritize the spatial. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's, that's where you're probably going to get most of your streams from. But then just keeping in mind that it could definitely change in the future. And those changes you intentionally made to get one experience closer to the stereo may not necessarily be there in the future. And my last suggestion would just be to also experiment with the binaural settings near mid-far. A lot of mixes I get, those haven't been touched at all. If someone was just working in spatial, they never thought to look at those, to play around with those. And I mean, that could be fine. But if you haven't changed those, your masters are more likely to bounce back, especially if it's through a label, or they just want different settings used, and kind of check the box that it's something you considered during the production process. So I would suggest, just play around with those a bit, try to get those dialed in, and just don't forget that they exist. So I guess my last thing to touch on would just be the loudness for Atmos as far as an album goes. So personally, I don't use the assembler. I have it, but it just doesn't really work with my workflow much. That can definitely be a great tool if you're looking to bring out different Atmos files and potentially tweak them, or just see how they're working. The way that I tend to do that, if I do want to go back and forth, is I'll just have Nuendo running the whatever session I'm working on, and then I'll have the separate renderer in the background with just a ADM loaded up there. It could be a different track from the same album, and I can easily go back and forth between the two, and just start and stop each one, and I can easily A/B and get a sense of the levels. What I also do is, I always have the stereo master up that I'm constantly referencing and comparing to, and there I can easily adjust the level of the stereo master. So if I have an album where I'm aiming to have a similar track-to-track level on the album, I might set a certain reference point that I want my stereo master at. It could be -6. So I'll go through, and in all of my Atmos sessions for that album, I'll put the stereo master at that same level. So whenever I'm comparing to it, I know I'm comparing at that same level, so then I can just match my Atmos to that stereo master. That can be a little trickier just because you don't necessarily know where your Atmos level will end up in relationship to that stereo master. So usually it's easier to do with a kind of a louder song that you might have on the album. So get the Atmos to the level you want it to be for that song, and then just match your stereo master to that same level, and then kind of just take note of what level that stereo master is at, and then you can go back to your other tracks on that same album and set your stereo reference to the same level, and then you can work your Atmos to that level. And once you match that, then you're essentially getting the same final level in the album from each track as it would be on the stereo. And the other thing that I do is I do work at a fixed level, so I basically know how loud anything is based on how loud it is in the room. So I do work at a different level on stereo compared to Atmos. I just have setting on my monitoring controller that I can just change. when I'm working on one versus the other. And then I just know how loud something is. At the start of the day, I might play a couple of tracks just to kind of reset my reference point there and make sure I'm kind of have my head in the right place of where a loud track is, where a not so loud track might be, and then I'm good for the day. And if I just know how loud something is without necessarily looking at an LEFS meter or anything like that. I just play it in the room, and I know, is this track super loud? Is it not? Like, it should be louder. Am I happy with how loud it already is? Do I want to push it further? That's more of a consideration for stereo, since with Atmos you're a little more restricted to what you can do with level. So that mainly plays into getting an album working at a specific level where I can jump around between the tracks in the album, and I just have a pretty good sense of how loud it actually is. So I can listen to one track, come back 10 minutes later, go to a different track, and just know, okay, they're roughly at the same level, or maybe, okay, this one's sounding a little too low. What do I want to do? If the other one's already at kind of the loudest it can be, I might want to bring a louder track down so that another one sounds a little more matched, if I can't necessarily push that one up because of the limitations that we can do with Atmos. So there can be a little back and forth, and the assembler could make that a little easier, especially if you just want to jump around throughout an entire album, but it's just not something that I particularly have a use for in my workflow. So those are the points I wanted to go through and discuss, kind of my general approach and how Atmos might differ from stereo, or how it's largely pretty much the same thing. It's not a different job. It's not something where you have to be a completely different engineer to be an Atmos mastering engineer. It's pretty much the same thing. You have to learn a couple more technical details and tools, how to use them, but at the end of the day, it's just pretty much the same thing. So I guess if you guys have any questions, if you want to dive deeper into anything I've covered, or ask any other Atmos related questions.
I have a couple of questions, but I would like to know if anyone else has questions of their own.
I'm sorry, I've been bopping in and out. You're incredible take. I love everything you said, and do you? I guess I'm just gonna cut to the chase. How do you check your spatial? Do you mix for spatial, or do you master for spatial at all, or are you more focused on the binaural side of things when it comes to that translation? And
no, I definitely focus on the spatial. I think that's one of the priorities. I think a lot of what I talked about was the translation to the speakers, just because that's kind of what I kind of have to bring in a project. It's been worked on only in binaural, and I'm the only one doing the speaker thing. But the spatial is definitely one of the biggest priorities. So, I mean, the workflow right now for me is I just export it, create the MP4, listen to on my AirPods to get the spatial. I don't currently have Logic running to get my spatial or anything like that. I mean, it is something I'm going to set up in the future, but it's just not something I have in the future at the moment. And there sometimes is some back and forth. Nowadays, with how spatial currently is, it tends to not be too much of a problem. If I made a drastic change to a mix, I might spend more time kind of A/B'ing the spatial of the original mix versus my master to make sure it's still translating. And again, those intentions are still there in the spatial. But most of the time, it's more so about just making sure things are okay, that we haven't lost any elements or anything like that. Everything is still translating reasonably well. It tends to be more the mixer engineer who is crafting that translation and balancing the binaural versus the spatial. Again, some people don't care at all about the binaural. They've only been listening to the spatial, so that's a case where I'm kind of more responsible for juggling those. But with a lot of the people I work with, they've done a lot of back and forth to kind of make those decisions of where they want things to be. So as long as I haven't changed too much, those intentions are still going to be there and translating how they want it to be. So in that case, I don't really need to focus too much on the spatial. It's more so about just listening to the spatial and deciding, do I want to change something or not? It's just kind of another reference point that I have to get my head around, similar to just listening to a stereo mix and deciding how I'm going to approach this master. It's not so much about the translation. It's more just understanding what I've been given.
Whenever you get a mix in, do you ever are you very deliberate about the moves if it was done in headphones, and you're just like, what, I can tell it was done in headphones, everything's kind of in the front. Are you moving their objects or do you kind of leave whatever the mixer sent and you you master from there, you enhance that and make sure it meets QC and everything?
It really just depends on who I'm working with or the mix that I've gotten. Sometimes it's pretty clear that there wasn't that much attention paid to creating the Atmos. So there's still many approaches I could take to that, whether it be, okay, let's just leave it as it is. It is what it is. I'm not the Atmos mixing engineer. I'm not going to take this mix and craft it into a more fleshed out Atmos experience. Or at the same time, it might be a case where I know some things aren't necessarily great, and the mix engineer might say, go to town with it, do whatever you want. I don't really care about this Atmos thing. And in that case, I might make some more drastic moves and just try to flesh out the Atmos a little more, make sure it's not going to get rejected by anyone at the label or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But again, I might not be paying that much attention to, I'm not going to be crafting an entirely new mix from something that might be just essentially a stereo mix in an Atmos file.
I have two questions. First, what's the conversation you have with the mixing engineer if they tell you, for example, that they are mixing on headphones? Do you try to make him or her understand what some translation issues might happen between the two listening environments? Do you go back and forward? You just do a take and see what happens?
Usually I don't have much of an opportunity to have back and forth. Usually it's more along the lines of, hey, I worked on this track. I did it all on headphones. Maybe I'm not sure about how it's really going to translate on speakers. So please do what you can with it. I don't usually have that much of an opportunity to have some back and forth and say, okay, maybe doing these things might not be a good idea, or you might want to mix things in this certain way to make sure it translates a little better onto the speakers. So it's usually more just I'm given something that I need to work with. If it's someone that I might be working with longer term, working more mixes with them or whatever it might be, then I'll definitely have a bit of a back and forth and maybe make some suggestions of, oh, hey, on this track, you put this over here and didn't work all that well. So, maybe consider doing it like this next time. So I definitely try to give whatever tips or suggestions I can, but most of the time I don't really have that opportunity to have a dialogue. I'm just given a mix and, hey, we need a master.
The next question is, which are some ways you are QCing your masters? Can you go a little bit more in depth with it? Which devices are you using? Are you listening to down mixes? If yeah, which ones? Does it also depend of the project you're working on? I know that in my work there are some things that, for example, jazz, I would consider how the 5.1 is sounding, because there's a market of people that have 5.1 systems and listen to jazz. But in something more pop, I won't. And if I know that something goes only to spatial audio, then I just listen to the headphones in spatial audio and speakers, and that's it. How do you approach it?
So as far as the main sort of QC in just making sure we have a file that's acceptable would just be playing it in the renderer on the speakers. That's kind of the main thing I'll check. I'm obviously going to listen through the entire track or whatever it might be, album, on just the speakers, kind of as the default, to kind of the literal QC of making sure everything's okay. And then from there, that's where I'll bounce around between the different formats. So that is largely based on what the project is, and both in terms of that kind of end user experience of who's going to be listening to this in what formats, and also in listening to the project and trying to predict where something maybe won't translate all that well to. So I'll usually bounce around the different formats in the renderer, so whether it be the 2.0 or 5.1, things like that, and just try to see if anything is sticking out. And then I'll export the MP4 and check the spatial. The binaural I don't usually tend to check in QC stage. That's more when I'm actually working in the DAW on the master. There I'll go back and forth between on speakers and the binaural. So when I'm QCing, I don't really check that binaural again. I kind of already I know that where that translation is going to be. So yeah, so then I'll check the spatial. That one I will again listen all the way through, make sure everything's okay there, since that's kind of where everyone's going to be listening to Atmos. So I got to make sure everything's translating okay, and that's also where you're more likely to have something go wrong, and you might have to go back. So that's pretty much all I check. I'm not checking on a sound bar or anything like that. I do check the 2.0, pull up the stereo, making sure it's reasonably similar. It's nothing's kind of sticking out and sounding like a completely different record. Yeah, so usually the spatial is kind of where I end things. That'll be my last step, and once I know that's good, I can then deliver the ADM plus the MP4, so that everyone else on the team can also check the spatial. The other thing I do tend to check is if it's a mix that uses the LFE, I'll just mute that. But that's more in the working process. I'll just turn it off, see that nothing is dropping out too significantly. Because again, that relates more to the end user listening experience of LFE signal. Obviously, often gets dropped, so you just got to make sure your mix isn't going to lose something critical if there's no LFE.
Yeah, let's go back to that in a bit. Aniket asked a question: how does transient information falls down to stereo from Atmos and vice versa? Like you talk about speaker spatial translation.
Yeah, so there's not much of a difference. I mean, you always lose something when you go to a lossy encoding, like with your MP4. So you could get transients changing that way, and with spatial you can get some dynamic effects going on that you need to watch out for. But in general, just as far as comparing your raw ADM on speakers versus the binaural on headphones versus comparing that to your stereo master, you're not going to really have any dynamic changes, unless obviously your stereo master was mastered in a way that changed going from the stereo mix to the stereo master might have a lot of dynamic processing on that, and then the Atmos mix that you received might be lacking that mastering process that the stereo mix received. So when you start out, your Atmos mix might dynamically be, or as far as the transients go, might be very different from your stereo master. And then that goes back to the team's approach and how they're looking to handle the Atmos, and whether they're looking to have you match the stereo as close as possible with the Atmos, whether they want something that's kind of completely different. The Atmos can be its own thing. So, maybe the stereo, they pushed it loud because they wanted a loud stereo master. And with the Atmos, they want it to be dynamic because you have that kind of ceiling of that loudness ceiling, and you can't go above that. So you might as well have a big dynamic mix. Whereas the stereo, they might have maybe compromised some of that. So you can get differences there, but as far as just the down mixing of it, you don't get any changes in the dynamics.
Are you getting requests to like have your Atmos stereo master like fold down replace the actual stereo master? Because like of how much of an improvement it is compared to the actual stereo mix and master. Because
no, that's not a request that I've had. I mean, usually with the stereo being the number one priority in the pipeline, everyone's been working on the stereo, and the Atmos is a bit more of an afterthought or something that splits off of the stereo at some point. The Atmos is the thing that's different from the stereo. So no matter what I do, no matter how great I make the Atmos, it's still different from the stereo. So the stereo is still the reference point that everyone has. So I haven't run into any situations where they love the Atmos so much, the stereo fold down of the Atmos so much, but they wanted to replace the stereo.
I've had a few, man. It's kind of crazy, and especially with like a few like recent label sessions, like just in the sense of like if you just have so much more headroom, like if when you deliver the Atmos master, and then the trick is like they're like, all right, can you master the Atmos like fold down to stereo like loudness, and like that's where like it gets wild that I've noticed. But I've seen that starting to become like a little bit more common from some like people. I know like Snoop Dogg recently had like a single that was released, as just a fold down from the stereo master. I mean, from the Atmos master, because they enjoyed it much more than the stereo mix.
Like I haven't had like a great experience with the stereo fold down translating exactly how it should. So it always turns out to be another mix for me, in my experience. I've heard also from other people that had like incredible success just down mixing it and then throwing a plugin for loudness, and that's it. There's another question from Roman. What are some common mistakes that people who do their mixes on headphones do? And to expand on that, what's your general impression of the mixes that you have been receiving lately? Like, in regards to how well or how extensively is being the space used? Are they filling the whole room? Primarily, like front-loaded movement, the use of the LFE? Do you think people are being very conservative or just experimenting and doing wild things?
So the biggest problem tends to just be things that end up being distracting on speakers, things that got panned maybe somewhere they shouldn't have been, or that are maybe just a little too loud, things that just poke out in the room where you don't really perceive that on the headphones. That's kind of the biggest issue that I find. But then there's also the issue I mentioned of the Atmos mix in the room being a lot more bare, a lot more almost unmixed, where you lose some of that connection between elements, and you kind of just have each element being around the room on its own, and that gives a very different feeling compared to listening to either a stereo mix or something on headphones. You just lose a lot of that cohesiveness, and so that's again something that I tend to run into a little more. It also depends just how dense the mix is. You have 50 different elements that you're panning around. That's not such an issue. But if you have 10 different elements and you kind of explode those out into the room, they're going to sound a lot more distinct, and they're each going to draw your attention. So I say those are the two main things to watch out for. As far as how people are using the space, it does tend to be all over the place. Some people are focusing more on the front. Some people are doing a more immersive of pulling elements kind of all around you. Some people use everything other than the front more for just a sense of space with things like reverb. I mean, that's not really something that I play around with much, because I'm working with what I'm given. I'm not really taking one thing and trying to change it into something else. So it's not like I take mixes that are mostly in the front and then pull them out to make them more immersive or anything like that. Usually just more respecting what I'm given. And I mean, I think that any approach can work, just because you have the space doesn't mean it needs to be used. So I have nothing wrong with mixes that are mostly in the front. I definitely wouldn't have something that's just stereo as an Atmos. That would be a little silly and not really. There's not much of a point to that. Even if that wouldn't bounce back and get rejected, I don't think that's really a good idea to make an Atmos that's just a stereo. So I would at least try to get a little extra widths, particularly pulling things out to the wide speakers. Even if you do want things mostly in the front, I would just aim for getting a little extra width to your mix if you don't want to have that entirely immersive all around you type vibe.
Do you find yourself doing a lot of like overall processing, like in all things, or are you going to specific objects and changing balances or EQ or whatever that you feel you need on your masters?
Usually I'm going for specific objects, assuming the mix isn't just kind of a main bed track or anything like that, or in just a couple of objects. Assuming the mix is somewhat exploded out into many different objects, I'll go into the individual objects. That tends to just be easier and simpler to do than trying to affect everything together. And I find I get a similar end result. Usually that's for matching to the stereo. I might have a certain element I want to EQ, especially if the stereo master itself has been processed in a way that isn't on the Atmos mix. The Atmos mix sounds like the stereo mix, and then the stereo mix got mastered and there was a lot of processing done there. And now I'm trying to match the Atmos mix to whatever was done to get from the stereo mix to the stereo master. So there can be some bigger differences that I'm trying to match. But even then, I find that EQing individual objects will usually get me to a similar place. Like if there's an EQ move made in the low end, I'll just go through whatever low end elements might be there in that range and EQ those. And at the end of the day, that's going to be pretty close to as if I had somewhat of a global EQ on everything. But my lead vocal doesn't need that EQ at 60 hertz. That's not really necessary. So if I just go into the individual objects, I'm going to get a pretty close end result to a global EQ. And also then I just have a bit more control in how I want to EQ things, which that does blur the lines a bit between mixing and mastering. I'm not a fan of stem mastering. I don't do any stem mastering for stereo, but obviously with Atmos, that's it basically is stem mastering in most cases. So it does blur the lines a little bit, but I just try to keep the mastering hat on and approach it more from a global perspective, even if I am diving into the individual elements of a mix.
Does it change when you get files where the mixer approached the mix, or where they basically used object bed, but like everything is going to an object bed and practically turning the mix into a 714 or 916 mix? Do you change your approach then and go global, or you still will go through each object?
If it's a situation where if we had, say, two objects with one being like a left piano channel and the other one being a right piano channel, then I'm going to approach those together. I'm definitely not going to EQ separately the same element, if that makes sense. Like I'm going to try to like take the kick and find all of those kick tracks, not necessarily different kicks, but if one kick is on two objects, I'm going to take those and EQ them together to avoid any kind of issues from EQing one but not another. But otherwise, I would still approach it just kind of as individual elements. Obviously, if I want to bring down the low end on everything, I would just copy that EQ onto everything. But otherwise, I'll still just try to focus on whatever specific object might need, or whatever specific object has what I'm looking to change.
Have you heard a bunch of new releases of just using the stereo master and placing it in each position, like each speaker position? And what are your thoughts on that kind of mixing process in Atmos, or like mastering process?
So taking the stereo master and just placing that into an Atmos file, essentially?
Yeah.
Or do you mean like putting the stereo master and copying it out into every position possible?
Yeah. Like the new All Is Yellow by what's his name? That album. It's using a lot of just like if you go solo each channel, like each set of speakers, it's just a stereo master.
I would say that that's not a good idea. Both just because it's not a good way to use the format. It's just kind of it's a pointless use of the format, and because you are going to get a lot of you're introducing a lot of problems with things like phase and things like that. So the end result in the room would actually be worse than the stereo. So you're kind of making something pointless that is going to be worse. So I mean, I wouldn't really stand behind that.
I feel that heavily.
But I mean, I haven't really run into that situation. I've gotten a couple where it's kind of like a stereo mix that has been Atmosized, but that still won't just be just the stereo mix. It's kind of stereo mix plus a little processing to add a little more to it. And I mean, that I'm okay with. If you want to just have a little extra space in the mix, you could definitely get something that works for the format and that gives you what you're after just by doing that. So I'm definitely not against that. I think it's probably better to have a little more control than just a stereo master that you're kind of
pushing everywhere, huh?
Atmosizing, but yeah.
That's awesome.
I don't know how that can be approved, like just
I got
from a label standpoint, or like I get it because I've heard some albums mixed like that, where the headphones sound okay, because I mean they're emulating a very perfect room, but like in an actual room, it sounds horrible. Like I just can't understand how, because that's very lazy mixing, and I would go that far to say that that's a scam, that they scammed the artists.
I think the new Jack Harlow single is the same thing. Loving on me, baby. The main stereo is just in left side, right side, and you should check that out. Yeah, in your rooms if you can play it back. Pretty interesting. But like the fold down, I mean, but it's a bop, if your room's tuned and everything, and you're in the mixed position, it's like, and then you just start soloing each speaker, like speaker pair, and you're just like, oh, it's just the same thing.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah, totally. You were telling us a little bit about your mastering process when mastering an album. As far as understood, you are mastering like each song in a different session? Is it any point that where you put everything in a session and then listen to it as a whole piece of work?
No, the only situation where I would do that is if I have cross-fading songs, things like that, any kind of overlap or transition where that transition is more important, where that's something I want to pay particular attention to. But I mean, usually, since most of the projects I do are a stereo project overall, that then gets an Atmos component, the stereo album is going to define most of that album experience for the Atmos. So it's not like I'm playing around with timings or anything like that of each track. So it's not like I have much freedom to change anything as far as the album experience goes. So listening through it as an album wouldn't really give me anything. I can just focus it on each chunk, each track being its own separate chunk. For stereo mastering, yeah, definitely I will. I do a lot more back and forth between tracks and adjusting things. Not just level, but other processing that I might need to adjust. It's constant jumping around for me with albums, and then of course, kind of setting the pace of the album and spacing between tracks and all that. And then at the end of a stereo album, typically I will just kind of pull it all in and listen through, beginning to the end of the album and be able to experience that album as a whole. But with Atmos, I mean, there's not really anything I can do. If I listen through it as an album and I don't like something, like a particular transition, it's not like I can change anything. The master is defining, the stereo master is defining that.
In regards to loudness, then you're just basically referencing the one before and the one after, using the renderer for playing the reference.
It would depend on how close we're trying to get to the stereo. If it's a situation where we want to be close to the stereo, then I just set my reference point between the Atmos album and the stereo album, and then essentially make it the same. So if you listen to one versus the other as an album, it's going to be everything will be at the same level. But if it's a situation where they don't particularly care about having the Atmos be exactly the same as the stereo, then yeah, I might play around a little more with level, kind of having a sense of where different tracks on the album are sitting, and yeah, how the previous or the next track might compare to it. But as I mentioned earlier, I base a lot of that off of just the levels in the room, rather than literally going back to the previous track and listening and saying, okay, this is where we're at. Okay, now we get to the next track. This is where I might want to be. I don't do so much of that listening back and forth. It's more just an intuitive sense of where things are sitting in relationship to each other.
Cool. At what level are you monitoring now that you talk about it?
So my system it's always been based on kind of the Dolby levels. So for smaller size rooms, it's usually between 79 and 82. That's for calibrating to the noise at -20 dBFS. So I'm set at 80, and then for stereo mastering, and just kind of listening to music in general that's been mastered, I listen at that gets set at -12 from the reference point, and then for stereo mastering, or just listening to for Atmos mastering, or just listening to Atmos content, I just bring that up to -6. So like on the renderer, I just have my level set to -6 on there, and that gets me to the level I want it at. It's somewhat arbitrary. Like the Dolby levels don't really apply for Atmos music. Those are for your cinema levels. So if you just play back Atmos music at 0 at those levels, it'll be way too loud. So there isn't really any particular reference level you should be at. It's more so just finding what you like, what you're comfortable with, and then getting used to that and just knowing how things are at that level.
Do you do any catalog work?
Yeah.
How do you go about getting the 24s to Atmos? 24 reel to reels.
I mean, I'm usually just getting, I'm not doing mixing or anything like that. So it's not really something I have to deal with.
Oh, okay.
I'm just, receiving Atmos mixes that I'm then mastering.
Nice.
So yeah, I don't have to deal with too much of a hassle of doing catalog work.
Do you?
I know a lot of labels are doing more of the AI based processing on stereo masters to get out stems and then create Atmos mixes from those kind of AI generated stems.
Yeah.
But again, that's not something I have any experience with, since I'm not doing any of taking stereo and making it into Atmos.
For your deliverables, are you also turning in Sony 360 renders, or mixes of? No,
I'm not doing any 360.
Yeah.
Just haven't really had any requests for it. I think I had one request for it, and even then that was kind of before Atmos took off. So at the very beginning of Atmos, people were a bit on the fence with whether 360 was one that's going to take off or whether it would be
Atmos.
Yeah. So that's really the only time I ever had any request for it. After that, no one really cared about 360, at least not the people I tend to work with.
I feel that. What kind of monitoring setup do you have, man? Sorry, you must have already gone over it.
It's basically all custom. It's just all speakers I build, and I'm in the process of building a new studio. So right now I'm just in a temporary space. So just mostly custom gear, not really too much I can recommend or anything.
That's sick. It's good.
Talking about speaker setups, would be very interesting to know what you are doing for calibration, and how are you calibrating your speakers, and do you have maybe some pinpoints for having a more cohesive listening experience in a room? Maybe widen the sweet spot a little bit, or integration with the LFE or bass management, etc.
Yes, I think beyond the basics of kind of setting the levels, which you can follow. Well, I know at this point Dolby has quite a few documents out, so it can get a little confusing on what you need to follow. I think the one I generally use, I think, is the home production environment. I forget the exact title of it. It's not. You don't want to be looking at the theatrical documents. And recently, they also published one specifically.
Theater, right? Home theater.
Yeah, I think the home theater. They
the music studio. I think they released. A couple weeks ago.
There's a new one specifically for making Atmos, for producing Atmos content, and that one had certain things that were a little iffy, and I wouldn't follow that document. But yeah, so I think it is the home theater one that you want to follow. So just follow those specs for levels, matching levels, setting the LFE level, and then also timelining everything is important. Either physically through the distance and making sure your speakers are at the same distance, or with a delay, certain milliseconds, wherever it might be built into your speakers or in the render, or however you want to delay your speakers to timeline them. And as far as setting the levels, you can do it either with a kind of a sweep-based measurement like REW, and that's kind of the best approach. You'll see exactly where everything is. Or you can use some noise and an SPL meter. I know the Blue Sky, the company that makes some speakers, they have a page on the website with some files you can download that are all that are filtered. You don't want to use just a full range pink noise. You need to use filtered pink noise. So they have some files on the website you can just easily download and use those. So you just play those out and look at your SPL meter and set the levels. So beyond that, one of the most important points, which most people tend to miss with setting up an Atmos system, is the importance of using the same speakers all around the system, or having a way to make sure that certain parameters are matched between the speakers. So even if you're using the same speakers from a different manufacturers, you're likely to still run into problems. You know, the PMC wafer speakers are pretty popular for all your surrounds, but then you might have something like the 6.2s for your LCR. So there you do run into a lot of problems. And I kind of found this out when I had to replace one of my surrounds, and hadn't really put too much thought into this. So the problem with using different speakers, even if they're from the same manufacturer, even if they're mostly the same, is the differences you have in the phase response of each speaker. So any difference in the phase response of the speaker will result in running into kind of phase issues, and especially when you're panning something that is between multiple speakers. You know, if you have one signal that's being sent to multiple speakers. So I kind of ran into an extreme example of this when I swapped out one of my surrounds, where with different kinds of crossovers, sometimes you have to invert the polarity of a specific driver. So with certain kinds of crossovers, you know, your tweeter might be inverted. So, you know, the woofer moves out. You know, typically your woofer moves back and forth. So while your woofer is pushing out, your tweeter sometimes will be pushing out. But with certain speaker designs, when your woofer moves out, your tweeter moves in. It's basically flipped. And I mean, that's pretty common. That's one of the most common types of crossovers that you'll find in all sorts of speakers. So what happens is, even if you have your crossover point at the same frequency between different speakers, well, now when you put a sound kind of panned between those two speakers, whatever it might be, you know, between two different surrounds you have, or between your left speaker and one of the surrounds, well, now your low end might be fine, where if you play a kick or a bass, you know, the woofers between both the speakers move out, you know, together. But now your top end, one is going to be going out and one is going to go in, you know, between your two tweeters, between those speakers. So, and I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with flipping the polarity on one channel and what happens there. So, you know, you use two different speakers, and now half of your signal is the right polarity and half of it is the wrong polarity. And, you know, it's not just a matter of flipping the polarity on that speaker, because now you just got the opposite going on. So that's kind of the extreme example. But if you're just using different speakers, you know, even if they're from the same manufacturer, you have different crossover points. You know, the tweeter to the woofer, the tweeter to a mid-range, that's going to be at a different frequency. So that's going to have a different phase response. And the phase response basically just means it's essentially just a time delay. So different frequencies will play out of your speakers at different points in time. You know, you get your high frequencies coming out of the speaker, and then you get your low frequencies coming out of the speaker at a later point in time. That's just kind of the nature of filters and EQs and all that. So, you know, if you have your crossover point at a different frequency, because it's a different speaker, could be from the same manufacturer, that relationship in timing between when the speaker receives the signal and when the speaker outputs a certain frequency is going to be different. So then you get those different phase effects happening of different frequencies canceling them out. So even though certain frequencies might still be sounding fine, other frequencies won't. So it kind of just becomes a mess when you have different speakers. So you'll notice that when you pan sounds around, different frequencies, depending on what sound you're panning around, might sort of disappear as you're moving it around or sound a little funny. Now, you can correct that phase response, or different manufacturers have different ways of doing that and making sure everything is the same. So there are ways to get around that issue and still use different speakers, but it's a little trickier and something you have to watch out for. Now, since it is very common to use different speakers, and most people aren't using either the same speaker or having a system that's actually set up to have everything matched up between the speakers, what you may want to do, which is something I recommend, but since I'm not mixing, it's not something I can necessarily apply in practice, is to keep signals a little more discreetly positioned in the room. So avoid, don't put a signal in the middle of the room. Don't take your object and pan it out into the center of the space where you have it coming out of all your speakers, because now you're having all the speakers play that same signal, and you're just going to highlight all those differences between the speakers. So it's best to try to keep things a little more discreetly panned, or if you do want to get that more of that sort of every speaker playing a certain signal, then use different things like a reverb or a chorusing or any other kind of modulation effect that's going to generate a slightly different signal that isn't so much the same identical signal, and then that's going to be a little less disturbing. You're not going to get all those differences, and things are going to be canceling out. So that's kind of, I do recommend trying to keep things somewhat discreetly panned, rather than just taking some elements and pulling them out around the room where it's going to get distributed to a lot of speakers. So that's kind of one way to work around those limitations of the majority of systems, and making sure that when your mix gets played on any other system, even if your system doesn't have that issue, that you're not going to have that certain elements just getting canceled out or sounding a little weird.
Yeah, I think that's also a very important topic to talk about. Even further, like, even if we're not talking about speaker manufacturers or the difference between speakers, is just thinking that the idea, or like one of the advantages of a format like Dolby Atmos is that it is scalable and can go to fewer speakers or more speakers. And the decisions you take with panning also determine how they will translate in, like, mostly thinking about fewer speaker systems. Like, if you pan something directly here to the sides, then maybe it won't translate as well into a 5-1 system, for example. And like being aware, and I think like you can bring elements to more inside the room or between speakers, but also to check, is important to check how they are going to translate when they're played in a let's call lesser resolution speaker system, because that is what we gain when we have 714 and then to 916, and then, I mean, the sky's the limit with the number of speakers you can have. But is resolution, is how well displayed are the different objects in the room. But then we don't want to people that have a lesser resolution room to then don't be able to understand the intention of the elements that were placed in the mix.
Yeah, and a lot of the times I'm usually working in 714 rather than 914 or 916, because there's an interesting effect, psychoacoustic effect called spectral splitting, which isn't really talked about much. But when you have a sound that's moving towards your side, like coming from your left speaker, going out, say your left surround speaker, kind of being panned that way, the way that we actually perceive that, there's what's called spectral splitting, where we don't have a very good sense of that directionality. And so we do get sort of a splitting in the spectrum where lower frequencies will be perceived differently from higher frequencies in terms of that movement.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just kind of take a sound and as you're listening to it, pan it back, you're going to hear that kind of get smeared, the lower versus the higher frequencies in where you perceive that to be. So even if you don't have a sound that's moving, you just place it somewhere in between there,
Mm-hmm.
You do get some of a loss in being able to localize that sound. So that's definitely something to watch out for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another aspect where you don't really hear that in the binaural, but when you pull it into speakers, now you kind of get that weird element missing somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And also with between the left speaker and your left surround speaker, there's a pretty large gap if you don't have the wide speaker. So you do also lose some of that localization precision by just having a large gap there. So I do think the wide speakers are very important, and they contribute a lot to the experience, just that extra width that they can give you. So I would recommend that everyone use the wide speakers, but at the same time, if you're depending on how you're using them, when you go down to the 7.1 or 5.1, you're going to lose quite a bit of your intentions in the mix because of what you placed kind of in that kind of front to side-ish area, just because we can't, both the distance between the speakers and how we hear, you just don't get that same precision that you imagine you're getting based on how you're mixing.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience with it. I think as you said, the wide speakers are like an awesome addition to, let's call it like the stereo image, like the things that you have in the front, but relying too much in the wide speakers, then it in my opinion doesn't translate very well to speaker systems where the gap is bigger.
Yeah.
And then we get into the discussion: are we mixing for a specific speaker system and speaker arrangement, or are we mixing for the room and for like the 3D space? And like all of them are valid. There are big records that are mixed that way, and you might also go to have like the aesthetic or the creative decision to make something a little bit more smeared when played in or that is not as important, that is a very let's call it like more tangible, more defined object, but as you said, it's something to be aware of. I mean, we're already, I think, about to break into the 2 hours. I think we can leave it like that with that. Thank you very much for the time and all your thorough explanations about your workflow and how you see working in Dolby Atmos and what your experience is. I think this is very, very informative for everybody. And yeah, would you like to point out some of the things you have worked on that you're very proud of, and you said like this represents like the pinnacle of my work? That'd be awesome to reference afterwards.
I say probably just check out some of the Burna Boy Atmos I've done, which I guess would be both the recent albums and the older ones that we kind of did as a back catalog. Yeah, I mean, it's a little tough to show your work as a mastering engineer because you don't get to compare it to the mix.
Yeah.
Whether I did something or not isn't something that anyone else ever knows. So it's a little tough, but yeah, the Burna Boy stuff is fun. Tends to be pretty immersive without being over the top, without having too many elements all around you.
And it's groovy still. You can dance to it. You can feel it. Awesome. Then let's leave it like this. Thank you again. And yeah, see you next time.